Ouattara-led Burkina Faso has refused to accept deportees from the United States in a snub to one of President Donald Trump's signature migration policies.
It began with a quiet request, the kind that usually passes unnoticed in the world of diplomacy. A letter here, a meeting there, polite words about cooperation. But this time, behind that calm tone, a storm was brewing. Washington had approached Burkina Faso with a proposal that sounded routine but carried deep insult. The United States wanted Burkina Faso to accept deportees from America, including people who weren't even Burkinabe citizens. For decades, African nations have received such requests and nodded politely. Some delayed, some complied. But this time in Ouagadougou, the response was fire. Foreign Minister Karamoko Jean-Marie Traoré didn't hide behind bureaucracy or diplomatic caution. He went straight to the national broadcaster, looked into the camera, and called it what it was: blackmail. He revealed that after Burkina Faso rejected the U.S. demand, Washington suddenly suspended all visa services in the country. Students, traders, and families were told to go to neighboring Togo if they wanted to apply for visas. It was framed as a technical adjustment, but the timing said everything. As Traoré asked the nation, "Is this a way to put pressure on us? Is this blackmail?" His words shook the room. It wasn't just a statement, it was defiance. For the first time in a long time, an African official stood before the world and refused to dress up humiliation as diplomacy. Burkina Faso, he said, is a place of dignity, a destination, not a place of expulsion. That sentence turned a small administrative dispute into a continental statement of independence. To Washington, this was about immigration management. To Ouagadougou, it was about sovereignty. Why should an African nation become the dumping ground for people rejected elsewhere? Why should a country struggling to rebuild after years of insurgency and foreign interference bear the burden of America's deportation policies? What Burkina Faso saw was an insult hidden behind paperwork, the message that African borders are still open for Western convenience. And when Traoré called it out, the U.S. response confirmed everything. Visa services suspended, no explanation, no apology. But this story isn't just about Burkina Faso. It exposes a much bigger system. A global industry built on displacement diplomacy. Western countries, especially the US and parts of Europe, have long used their influence, aid, and legal pressure to offload deportees onto smaller, dependent nations. A few $1 million in development aid here, a new military training program there, and suddenly a government agrees to host people who have no link to its soil. On paper, it looks like humanitarian cooperation. In reality, it's the outsourcing of moral responsibility. The deported arrive with no papers, no home, no future. The host country gains nothing but trouble, social tension, economic strain, and the humiliation of having its sovereignty auctioned. That's why Burkina Faso's rejection was revolutionary. It wasn't just a no to one deal. It was a refusal to be part of an entire system that treats Africa as disposable. Other nations like Rwanda, Ghana, and Eswatini have quietly accepted small batches of deportees in exchange for promises of aid. But every acceptance blurs a nation's independence just a little more. Because when your borders can be opened by another country's decision, sovereignty becomes negotiable. Traoré's government understood the principle. Accept one deportee, and you accept the logic that your territory is up for bargaining. For a country rebuilding its identity after decades of colonial interference, that was a line that could not be crossed. Washington's reaction revealed something deeper, that deportation deals aren't about compassion or partnership. They are tools of power. When the U.S. couldn't get its way through persuasion, it used bureaucracy. Visas became the new weapon of obedience. No bombs, no sanctions, just a quiet announcement on an embassy website. And suddenly, thousands of Burkinabe citizens were locked out of travel, education, and trade. That's soft power at its coldest, control not through war, but through paperwork. In today's world, mobility is privilege. To travel, study, or work abroad is often the only route to advancement for young people in developing nations. Western powers understand this and they exploit it. Comply and your citizens can move freely. Resist and your airports become cages. The brilliance of this system is its precision. It doesn't target governments directly. It punishes the middle class, the students, the professionals, the very people who keep their country stable and connected. When they suffer, they pressure their leaders to give in. But this time the strategy failed. In Burkina Faso there was no apology, no diplomatic panic, no public statement begging for reconsideration. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's government stayed silent, deliberately, because acknowledging coercion as dialogue only strengthens the coercer. That silence spoke volumes. It was the silence of self-respect, and it revealed something powerful about the age we live in. Visas have become the modern colonial passbook, the 21st century version of the papers that once determined which Africans could move under foreign rule. Back then, it was colonial administrators deciding who could cross a border. Today, it's embassy algorithms doing the same. Different tools, same philosophy. Control mobility, control freedom. The irony is sharp. The same West that preaches open borders and global cooperation uses visas as punishment tools. It's not about security, it's about compliance. It's about reminding African nations who still holds the keys. For Burkina Faso, this became a test of self-definition. Would it yield for convenience or stand firm for principle? Chose dignity. And in doing so, it exposed how fragile Western power has become. Because once a nation stops fearing isolation, isolation loses its power. And other nations are noticing. Across Africa, governments are asking the same question. At what point does cooperation become submission? From Nigeria to Eritrea, from Ghana to Sudan, leaders are beginning to see Burkina Faso's defiance not as rebellion, but as responsibility. This shift marks something historic, the rise of assertive sovereignty. A new generation of African leaders, unshackled from the psychology of colonial fear, is emerging. They are not anti-Western, they are pro-African. They do not reject partnership, only manipulation. They've studied how aid turned into control, how democracy promotion turned into interference, and how migration partnerships became moral blackmail. Now they're rewriting the rules. Burkina Faso's stand is both a mirror and a message. It reflects the growing awareness that true partnership must be equal, and sends a signal that Africa is no longer afraid to say no. Because saying no is not hostility, it's maturity. In Western capitals, the real fear isn't Traoré's defiance, it's imitation. Because if one African nation can reject a US demand and survive, what happens when 5 do? Or 10? That's when the balance of global power begins to shift. And that shift has already begun. Across the Sahel and beyond, a new political psychology is taking root, one where refusal is seen not as defiance but as duty. The age of submission is ending, and the age of self-definition is here. Burkina Faso's stand wasn't just political, it was spiritual. It was a declaration that Africa's dignity is not for sale. For too long, the continent's story has been written by others, always in the language of need, never in the voice of strength. That narrative is cracking. Ibrahim Traoré's government has built its revolution around a single truth. Africa's strength begins where its fear ends. When a nation no longer fears losing aid, visas, or Western approval, it becomes untouchable. And that is what the West fears most, an Africa that needs no permission to be proud. The refusal to take deportees wasn't about migration, it was about migration of thought. A mental shift from dependency to determination, from obedience to ownership. What began as a visa dispute has become a symbol of liberation. Once a country learns to say no to coercion, it begins to say yes to its destiny, and that's the quiet revolution spreading across the continent, not through violence or speeches, but through the simple power of refusal. Africa is remembering its worth. Burkina Faso may not make headlines in Washington, but across the continent, its stance echoes like a drumbeat. Africa bows to no one. A new era is unfolding. An Africa that is unbought, unbowed, and unafraid. And from this moment on, no foreign power can claim to speak for the continent again. Because Africa is finding its voice. And this time the world will listen.